I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast. And I have a unique guest joining me today. I have John Redfern, who is the president and CEO of Eavor Technologies. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thanks for having me.
This is going to be a fun one, folks. It's an interesting topic, a little bit different than what we've covered in the past. Eavor Technologies is a geothermal company. And let's start things off. John, explain to everybody what Eavor Technologies is and what makes you guys special.
Well, we're a next generation geothermal energy company. And geothermal, I think most of your listeners will have a rough idea of what that usually entails. What that usually entails is looking for hot aquifers, usually in volcanic or Pacific Rim of Fire type areas, finding a hot aquifer with high enough permeability that they can, once they found it, they can delineate it, they can drill it up, they can bring that hot water to surface. And once there, they can use it for district heating or to generate electricity. We're completely different. In fact, we like to say there's a bigger difference between us and regular geothermal than there is between geothermal and oil and gas. Geothermal and oil and gas, as I described, are these exploration games. It's all about looking for a resource and managing subsurface risk. For ourselves, we've taken the geology out of it, taken the forecasting uncertainty out of it, and made something that's a repeatable sort of industrial process with very little risk. So, but how do we do that? We do that by, instead of extracting water from the reservoir, which is always difficult to predict, we just build a massive subsurface radiator, leveraging off a lot of the drilling innovations from the Shale Revolution. And by massive, I mean several kilometers down, 4 or 5 kilometers down, and enough horizontal laterals off that we're talking about. Well, I'll give you an example. Our first commercial project has 280 kilometers of wellbore in it. And the water goes through that, sort of pumps itself through a thermosyphon effect, if you know what that is, and brings that water to surface where it's extracted. But the only thing moving the heat around is conduction, no carrier fluid. But that makes all the difference and makes our whole process more scalable.
Perfect. Yeah, the interesting thing I've found about geothermal is there was a period of time in around 2009, 2012, I would go to these resource investment conferences, as I still do, but I would come across about 5 or 6 geothermal companies. And as you said, they were always kind of in that ring of fire region because they needed volcanic activities in order to make them functional. But after the resource, sector kind of went quiet after 2012, I haven't seen a geothermal company in years. And the only time I hear about geothermal on any sort of a scale is in Iceland. What's happened to the industry in the West that's caused it to kind of disappear the way it has?
Okay, a couple of things to unpack there. One of the things I'd say right away is that, yes, everyone always knows about Iceland, but do you know which country on the planet actually has the highest percentage of their electricity generated by geothermal?
I do not.
Kenya, with over 50%, whereas Iceland actually gets more of their power from hydro than they do geothermal, but they're number 2. But it shows you the potential when even using traditional geothermal, a place like Kenya can get half their power from it. The other observation you have is interesting in that the conferences you went to, things sort of disappeared. There's 2 different types of geothermal companies. Can be companies that are there primarily as developers, playing a very familiar oil and gas game of getting some license areas, proving them up, and then flipping the asset once you found the resource or developed a resource. And then there's other people who are, building technology that changes the way people search for stuff. And yes, on the developer side, where you're just looking for license areas and looking to develop, looking for a buyer, putting together a package that you can get financed, those go up and down with with when there's incentives or when there's a price spike or when there's some bit of government policy. But when it came to actually looking at the technology and doing something different, the whole sector has been a bit of a ghost town. There's nothing out there. When we started about 7 or 8 years ago. When we started, it was about 10 years before that. That was the last real investment in anyone who tried to develop next gen geothermal, and I think that was Altarock. And then they had this sort of 10-year desert, I guess is a better term, where there was no investment at all, either in development opportunities, but especially not in technologies. And then when we started back in 2017, there was a couple of companies, ourselves, Fervo, Greenfire, then a bunch of others came and followed us, and this sort of fed on itself. And so now there are literally dozens and dozens of developers. Some are, like I say, just developing the resource, but there's other people doing actual technology, people like Quays at MIT, which is using millimeter wave to vaporize rock and drill it that way. But before it was very sleepy. A lot of people were viewing it as a zero-sum game. There was not much upside. Not even the oil industry was interested in it because they felt it just wasn't scalable given the current technology. And yet here we are 7 years later, where we've raised over $500 million. Fervo is very similar. And there's dozens of other companies who have raised serious VC money. So it's actually, it's interesting that the cross section of conferences you've gone to has sort of missed this out. But there's never been as much activity going on in geothermal as there is right now. Certainly not as much money going into it as there is right now.
Yeah, I find it actually really interesting because at one time, and as I say, this goes back to the conferences that I was attending. It was before Fukushima, but one of the things that they were particularly promoting at the time was this was an alternative to nuclear energy in seismically active areas. Then Fukushima occurred, and of course that probably amplified that argument to some degree. But roughly at the same time as Fukushima, you talk about the desert in your sector. We had a desert in ours as well, and all those arguments, kind of went away. Now, you talk about this being a very good growth industry away from where it was back when I was familiar with it. You mentioned Kenya, which if you asked me to name the country outside of Iceland, I would probably have listed a whole bunch of others, and Kenya wouldn't have even been on the list. So, what areas of the world is taking this as an alternative seriously and are looking to incorporate it into their grids?
Well, let me tell you sort of what has really driven our business. What has driven our business was the idea that the real key to get real money interested in this and get the oil industry interested in it was to show that it was scalable. And to do that, like I say, we took the geology out of the equation by just turning into a big radiator. And the other thing that's driving it, of course, is the growth. I know it sounds ironic to say, but the growth of wind and solar actually created a coattails effect that created the need for something like us or something like nuclear. because wind and solar are great. They're super cheap on a naked per kilowatt hour basis, but they're intermittent. They're not reliable. When the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing, you're in big trouble. So you need something that's firm, that's also low carbon. And the fact that people are really looking at SMRs, small modular reactors, is proof positive that there is a market demand for that. People just have a hard time selling nuclear politically, and they've got other issues, obviously. We actually fill that same niche because, again, we're green, we're scalable, and we're baseload. In fact, we're better than baseload. We're totally dispatchable, and that's an important attribute. We also have, say, we don't have the same physical footprint necessary space-wise as some of these other alternatives like wind and solar, which may not be important in Western US because they got lots of space, but in Europe, Japan, or Singapore, places like that, that's another big driver. But the events that really drove demand for our product were, first of all, when we started, the idea was, okay, we're facilitating the green transition by being the perfect complement for wind and solar. Again, because the more green intermittent energy you had, the more you needed a firm backup that was also green. But that, as we all know, is a slow process because people are reluctant to change, and climate change is a slow process. So it's too easy for politicians to ignore it for a few years. The thing that really changed things for us was the invasion of Ukraine. Why was that important? Because it changed it from just an energy transition question for people in Europe to one of energy security or energy independence or autonomy politically even. And so all of a sudden, they said, wait a sec, places like Germany, they had got off coal, they've got off nuclear, they were getting off Russian gas. The whole country has a district heating grid in every town. What are they going to heat the water in those grids with? The only other green alternative is biomass, which isn't very green, isn't very scalable. And so almost overnight, when that happened, we had dozens of municipalities, if not more, all wanting us to build them in Everloop, basically. And that's really been powering it. And that's why we've been focusing on heat in Europe as a killer application. But of course, you're using some AI yourself in recording and making a summary of this interview. The whole AI revolution is incredibly energy hungry. Up to now, we've been assuming that electricity demand would be leveling off, even with EVs. When you look at the demand now for people like Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, I guess you're supposed to call them Meta now, it's huge, and they cannot fulfill that demand, and it's restricting their ability to expand. And so now those type of companies are beating down our door saying we need green electricity, and that's really driving what we can, what we need to do and how we can contribute. But it all makes this huge market demand that drives our business forward.
Now, you mentioned something called the Everloop, which is what makes your technology different from the others. Can you explain what the Everloop is and how it is different?
Okay. I would encourage people, if they're really interested, to go on our website and they'll see graphics describing it. But if I had to explain it in words, basically, as I said earlier, it's a big radiator, but it's a radiator that's drilled by having two wells side by side, drilled simultaneously by two different drilling rigs. In the example of Gerrit's Reed in Germany that we're halfway through building right now, we would drill both wells down to 4.5 kilometers. Then we'd sort of turn horizontal, split each of those wells off into 12 laterals, go several more kilometers, so we have lots of surface area, and then join all 12 of those lateral or 24 of those laterals to make, 12 loops really, toe to toe at the end. So when you think of it, that sort of drilling loop from start to finish, the water molecule has to go about 15 kilometers uninterrupted. That's a lot of drilling, something that wouldn't have been possible before, but which we can do now. And we think we've got ways of driving down the cost of that to make it economic. Now, once you've drilled out that large radiator, what do you do with it? You fill it with a little bit of, fresh water, nothing toxic or nothing else. We seal that radiator, and then we use a small pump to start the water flowing in one direction. Once it starts flowing in that direction, one side of that radiator and the up pipe will be hot water, which is less dense. The water going down will be cold, so it'll be high, higher density. And that density difference creates a thermosyphon effect where the whole loop pumps itself without any parasitic pump loads for as long as you let it, 100 years if you want. And so it's just almost like a perpetual motion machine. And you as that heat comes to surface, you scrape it off and use it through a heat exchanger to use it for either the local district heating grid and or you create the electric power with.
Do you need to be in an aquifer in order to make this work, or does the water come from other sources?
The advantage of our system is we don't need an aquifer. In fact, it's even better if there's no aquifer and if it's not permeable. We just set up this radiator, and the water is on the inside of the radiator, and that's fresh water we just add ourselves. And outside is this hot rock that is, having the heat drawn out of it just through a process of conduction, which is a, very, very, it's a slow process, it's very predictable and continuous process.
I'm located as you know on Prince Edward Island in Northeast Canada. So I'm surrounded by water. Does the water have to be fresh water, or I have this giant pool of salt water all around me? Can salt water be utilized in your system?
Salt water could be. In fact, as you know, when we're drilling a traditional geothermal and taking water out of the ground, it's all very briny or salty, got lots of impurities in it anyways. I'm sure you could use salt water, but once you have salt water, it's, some of the metal parts in the vertical pipe can be corroded more. You can have all sorts of, it works better and more continuously and less maintenance with the fresh water. But the volumes of fresh water involved in our system are really minuscule, compared to the size of the, it's like, filling a couple of swimming pools and then leaving it there for a century. You got to top it up a little bit every once in a while, but it's not a real user of water. Other technologies or ways to do traditional geothermal, like people who want to frack to do geothermal, they use tremendous amount of water because they have to inject water into the reservoir. A lot of it's lost and at high volume, and then they got to bring it up and it's salty and got other stuff in it, so they got to treat it. So there's really no incentive to use anything other than fresh water. Well, I shouldn't say that, sorry. Fresh water is an excellent fluid to use for this. We have, of course, plans and have done a lot of research in the past on alternative working fluids for this, stuff like phase change materials and that could theoretically, if we came back later, boost the production from these wells. But for the start, we're finding fresh water is the best solution and the cleanest and the one with the least risk.
And you're not reliant on, materials that have to be mined, such as uranium, as an example.
Absolutely. I mean, as it is right now, the world is either, you pick a world where you have oil wells everywhere and all problems with hydrocarbons. But one of the main ones is that, hydrocarbons are not distributed uniformly. and it becomes a volleyball in international politics. It gives people, it undermines independence of energy independence and political independence of lots of countries. The new technologies, like wind, solar, and batteries, are exactly the same, except instead of having to drill a whole bunch of wells, there's actually a huge mining component to that. And you have situations where you said you like talking about China. I mean, a place like China controls about 80% of each step in the value chain in the solar industry. So one of the advantages of something like Eavor is that all you need is roughnecks and steel, which everyone has or can get. And then every country can produce their own power to the extent they need it. And in fact, they can produce that power right next to wherever the demand is. So you don't end up with all the issues of pipelines and transmission lines and people protesting or not wanting someone else's infrastructure in their backyard. People vote for the power they want. And with this sort of technology, every town can be self-sufficient, which makes a hyper-resilient grid. Or in some cases, we don't even need a grid.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because you talk about this being scalable. So, like, is it scalable down to like a neighborhood? But
No,
you're suggesting it's more like a town or a village.
It's scalable in that it can go as big as you need it to be. Because that's what larger companies like the oil majors are looking for. That's what can move the needle on climate change and all that. You want something that can do gigawatts and gigawatts, whereas traditional geothermal, it's only about 0.4% of the electricity generated on the planet, and it can be a lot more once you do something like we're contemplating.
I see. So you would have like a smaller geothermal plant in, say, Charlottetown, which is a population of approximately 60,000. And then you could take the same technology to a city, say, like Montreal, that's 2 million people. And all you need to do is just scale that up so that they have sufficient power.
Yeah. I mean, the early days were focused more on larger towns because we want to really scale up quickly. But yeah, you could do it in Charlottetown with one loop, and you could probably do a whole bunch of loops for Toronto. In our case, we're starting out with the towns of Garrett's Reed and Wolfratshausen. They're quite small. But the first project is doing both the local heating and electricity into the grid. The next one, which is a pure heat project, is going to be in Hanover, which is a town of about 500,000 people, which is a decent size for Germany. And we'll do a few Eavor loops for them. But it's the scalability is saying there's no upper limit to how much power we can add. Because you just end up going deeper and drilling more if you need more power.
Okay. The obvious place to make the comparison, obviously you're green. So,
Right.
Your coal and your natural gas, fired power plants, you have a green component to it that, makes, you more green and environmentally friendly. So it kind of puts you on the same scale as nuclear and what they're trying to do with these SMRs. On an economic standpoint, how do you compare? Like, what's a timeline for, say, a geothermal project of yours nature versus building and creating an SMR of a similar capacity? And the timeline to build them and the economics of building those?
Traditionally, I would say that both geothermal and nuclear, especially nuclear, were always very slow to be implemented. You look at what we're doing, I mean, in that case, it's 10, 12 years or even much longer in a lot of cases. Our case, because we take the geology to a large extent out of the equation, we know what the performance is going to be before we even drill. And we can order, the power plant, the organic Rankine cycle, power plant ahead of time. We can compress that development period, hopefully down to a few years. As it is now, we started the company, developed the technology, made design decisions, started the project, installed the power plant, and we'll have enough drilling done that next year we'll have, after only a few years, we'll have done that, not just started a project, but then a first of a kind project and developed the technology. Well, in that case, all in 7 years. So we think we can be a lot faster to scale up. The other reason we can be faster is we basically own our design. It's proprietary. It's all protected by patents and a whole bunch of other know-how and exclusive supplier relationships. And what that means is that we can license anyone who wants to and provide them, the critical tools they need to do that. And so, we're only a small company of about 150 people, but, we can go to a BP or some other large oil company, and they can go and, they have the resources to take our technology, which is, like I say, which we've protected, and really drill lots and lots of really scale up quickly, faster than we ever could. And we're quite happy just getting a royalty.
So the technology itself is set up so that a larger company could take and run with this. So outside of Germany, where else in the Western world is looking at this technology seriously?
Lots of places looking at it seriously. Our core, as I said, is Europe, and we've got well slated for the Netherlands, another that's coming up being operated by another company in Romania. Got lots more opportunities in Germany. Those are all, European heat opportunities. The next juiciest opportunity after that is the hyperscalers who run all the data centers, the Amazons and Microsofts of the world. And they need so much power that they're really willing to sit down with us and, jointly to plan out how we can help them over the next 5, 10, 15 years. And that's very exciting. The other country that is of keen interest for us, and you can probably guess it because you mentioned Fukushima. Again, you've got a very wealthy, advanced industrial country like Japan, but all the power, they got very little indigenous power. So traditionally, they've done a lot of coal, a lot of nuclear. They don't want to do either, but they don't want to cover the limited land area they have with windmills and solar panels, and they'd still need a ton of batteries. So for them, for Japan, we represent a real opportunity, especially since they've got a lot of high temperature gradients as well, being on the Pacific Ring of Fire, and they've got lots of incentives. And some of our best investors are also from Japan. So I think we're going to have lots of activity there because we got some strong relationships there, especially with Chubu, the third largest electric utility in Japan, who's not only an investor in our Topco, but is also a 40% owner of our first commercial project in Germany.
Wonderful. So if people want to learn more about this and follow the company a little bit closer, how would they do so? And where are you trading?
Okay, well, we're not trading yet because we're a private company, but of course, IPO is always a target eventually. Right now, it suits us to be private, and we've got lots of support from our investors, both financial and help and advice in whatever their particular specialty is. when it comes to, what was the other question? Oh, how to follow it.
How to follow you,
us.
yeah.
Yes. The best thing to do is we've got a very extensive website, this Eavor.com. And again, Eavor is spelled EAVOR.com. Sort of like the marketing guy said, it's an endeavor with no end, which seemed to be a little bit too tricky. You take end off endeavor and you got the right spelling.
Oh, it's a cute way of looking at the company name for sure. So we will place that website at the end of the summary of this podcast and discussion. And I look forward to having you on again as the projects in Germany reach their culmination and how that's going to work and where the company's going to go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Pop in next summer and we should have some power going onto the grid. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. Look forward to that. Thank you very much for your time, John.
You're welcome.
The Prospector News Podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.